Who is afraid of Virginia Woolf? No, not the play, not the film. I'm talking about Virginia Woolf herself. Why are so many readers so hesitant to enter her world? Is it the whirlwind of thoughts? The unpredictable emotional journey that disturbs and lays us bare? Woolf wasn't afraid, not of breaking the rules of storytelling, not of stepping deep into the inner life of the mind. So let's be a little brave today. In this new series, we'll walk together through Mrs. Dalloway and with Mrs. Dalloway. A single day in the life of Clarissa Dalloway, where every thought and memory opens a window into who we are and what we fear. The publication of Mrs. Dalloway in 1925 places it right after the First World War ended. And it was a time of absolute social, political, economic chaos in Europe. What happened in the First World War is that the entire belief system in nationalism, heroism, and even rationalism was completely shattered. What remained was a widespread disillusionment. People stopped believing in anything good, anything related to progress and development. For many artists and writers, this disillusionment was countered through a rejection of the traditional forms and values. In 19th century, what we have linear plots, omniscient narrators, mostly black and white characters, clear moral boundaries, but that was no longer adequate to capture the fractured reality of this post-war world. So, writers like Virginia Woolf turned to new forms and created new genres. We also have to keep in mind that this was a period where we saw a rapid urbanization, development of the field of psychoanalysis, and a general sense of anxiety in people. So, obviously, literature became that zone where a lot of experimentation was going on. If you look at the themes that are handled in modern literature, especially in modern novels, you'll see that time is a very important factor or a theme. Usually, we have the idea of time as linear, unidirectional, going from past to present into the future. Now, modern writers challenge this idea. You would see that the novel Mrs. Dalloway takes place as a single day. But within this limited time frame, Woolf manages to pack an entire lifespan, thereby challenging the limits and limitations of time. The other theme which the modern fiction writers frequently talk about is fragmentation. It's not that the world is fragmented, that is true, but more than that, the individual is also fragmented, unsure of who an individual really is. And this looking inwards gives a sense of subjectivity, which is also a very important theme in modern fiction. And this is where the particular phrase stream of consciousness comes into play. We'll talk about it at length just after a few minutes. First, let's look at another very important theme, I would say, that is the theme of alienation. Now, with the growing disillusionment with reality, with modernization, with urbanization, a growing distrust of the person sitting next to you is very automatic and natural, and that leads to the alienation of man. You would find this not just in fiction, but also in poetry, if you have done Iliad, and definitely in drama. And this kind of expands to a great degree when you finally reach the absurdist theatre, and I've already done Waiting for Godot. If you have watched that, you would know what I'm talking about. So alienation is where you are feeling disconnected. So in the novels that we find in the modern period, the characters, especially the central characters, they are alienated from the rest of the world. And why are they alienated? Because they cannot accept what others feel acceptable. So, a clash of value system, that is something which is found. So, whenever you approach any modern fiction, you have to keep these things in your mind that these are the prominent themes we will be looking at, no matter who the writer is. And they are very common even in D.H. Lawrence, in James Joyce, and in any modern fiction writer you name. When you come to Virginia Woolf as a person, we have some very, very interesting details about her, which makes her very different from even the other modern poets and writers of her times. She was born in 1882, and at that time her name was Adeline Virginia Stephen, daughter of Leslie Stephen, who was a very intellectual person. In fact, he was the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. So you can imagine the kind of childhood she had. The children were educated at home. She had access to her father's huge library, but it was not a fairy tale. It never is. She was only 13 when her mother passed away, and her father died when she was 22. She faced sexual abuse at home in the hands of her half brothers. These kinds of circumstances added to her growing anxiety, which led to a lot of conflicts in her, which were not that well diagnosed back then. But still, it's likely that she suffered from some variation of bipolar disorder. I'm not an expert to say anything about that, but looking at her frequent breakdowns and episodes of depression, it's likely that she suffered from some kind of disease very, very similar to or possibly a variation of the bipolar disease. She was 30 when she got married to Leonard Woolf. He was a very supportive partner and a political thinker. In fact, together they founded the Hogarth Press. And this Hogarth Press published not only works by Virginia Woolf but also by writers like T.S. Eliot, Sigmund Freud, his translations, and many emerging writers. So, yes, she had her dark moments, but she emerged victorious because the way her creative life flourished, it was amazing. Back then, being a woman writer was still not a very, very conventional thing. When you talk about Virginia Woolf, you should always also remember that she was a part of the Bloomsbury Group. And what was this Bloomsbury Group? It was a circle of writers, artists, and intellectuals who were located in and around the area Bloomsbury in London. You have figures like M. Foster, Lytton Strachey, the biographer, Leonard Woolf, Virginia's husband. So there were prominent intellectuals in this Bloomsbury group, and Virginia Woolf actively participated in that arena. And this Bloomsbury group believed in individual expression, freedom of thought, the importance of art and literature. So this was a kind of space that she could utilize to explore her own ideas more freely and experiment with different forms of writing she could think of. If you really want to have a full knowledge about what she thinks of fiction, especially of the different forms of novels that she was looking at back then, you should read up her essay, Modern Fiction. There, she challenges the Edwardian writers, like the writers immediately before the modern age. The Edwardian writers saying that they focused too much on the material world, what is outside, on describing social settings, outside scenery, appearances, and all. And they ignored the most important component, that is the mind or the human mind. And she calls this the luminous halo, the consciousness. And she writes in the modern fiction that this is the most important focus area of fiction. This should be. And I would read out her quote. She writes that life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. So if you are writing fiction, which is a reflection of life, then you cannot make it artificial, like you've decorated a street with gig lamps. That is good for a stage, not for life. What is life then? And she says, a luminous halo, a semi transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. So, something which is not describable, but you have to communicate the feeling that there is more to it than what is visible. So, this is her point of view, which we find from her essay. And this is the central concern when she writes Mrs. Dalloway. So, in Mrs. Dalloway, more than the events that are described, more than the appearances of the characters, you have to focus on the inner workings of these characters. So, this inner life is communicated through what? Not through linear descriptions, flat commentary, not through the eyes of an omniscient narrator who can see what the characters are doing and tells you what is happening. No. That inner working of the mind can be translated only through or from the subject whose mind we are talking about. And the process is stream of consciousness. So this term, stream of consciousness, was first used by William James. He was a psychologist and also a philosopher. And in his book, The Principles of Psychology, which came out in 1890, Virginia Woolf was 8 years old then. William James described the consciousness as an unbroken stream or a flow which contains thoughts, feelings as well as impressions. So in literature, when we talk about stream of consciousness, it refers to a particular narrative technique, narrative method. What is a narrative method? Whenever a novelist or any storyteller begins to write something, it is an act of communication to the reader, right? The story is told to the reader. Who is telling the story? Not the author, but a voice inside the novel or the story, who we call the narrator. And the way this narrator speaks, it can be of many ways. Like we have third person narrative technique, where the narrator is not part of the novel, is not part of that character setup of the novel, and is outside and is speaking as a third person. The narrator can be one of the characters also, right? In that case, it becomes first person narrator or narrative technique. In stream of consciousness, what happens? This narrative technique is changed in a very peculiar manner. Here, the narrator can be third person narrator, that is not one of the characters, or a first person narrator, that doesn't matter. But the technique is different from conventional narratives. What is the difference? Here, the narrative technique represents the inner flow of the character's thoughts. And when we think, we don't always think in a very methodical, straightforward manner. Like you're listening to me now, but there's a possibility that only 30 seconds back, you were actually thinking about something very different. You were listening to me, but you were thinking about something very different. Or maybe now, right now, you're not really focusing on what I'm saying, but you're thinking about a notification you are not getting from your friend. And then that might lead to some other kind of thought. And this is especially true when we are sitting, doing nothing, feeling blank, and suddenly we begin to think. And it's not very common that we feel blank. Even when we think we are feeling blank, we are still thinking something. And those thoughts are connected to each other, following a very peculiar logic. Like you think one thing, then something else comes to your mind. There is definitely a connection. Sometimes you don't even understand the connection. Like when you look at a particular color, why does a friend's face come to your mind? There is no connection. But maybe there was a connection which you don't realize there is. So stream of consciousness is always there when we are thinking. If a narrator begins to narrate a story following that stream of consciousness, then what happens? Then as readers, we might sometimes get confused because we don't really know why one thing leads to another, why one thought leads to another. There is no apparent connection, and that is the tricky part. So there is no structure, There is no line to follow, there is no logic to find out. You simply have to trust that this thought leads to that thought. And inside whose mind? Inside the mind of the central character. Sometimes a couple of characters are taken up and their minds are explored in like this way. And Virginia Woolf has mastery over it. And the stream of consciousness works through what then? Some very unpredictable connections, repetitions, memories, and interruptions. Because you see, when we are really focusing on something, thinking hard, even then it will be interrupted. You will begin to think of something else. That means you're not always in control of your line of thought. The better you focus on something, you allow yourself a greater time to focus on that. But even there will be some interruption. It's like the phone notifications that come when we are watching something in your phone. Similarly, it happens with our brain. We're thinking about something and some different thing comes as a notification there. And that is called interruption. Just where we are about to think something, solve something, something happens. And the narrator captures this. So our target is to identify these moments in the text when we will be reading it. James Joyce, Marcel Proust, and Dorothy Richardson. These are the other three great creators who used this technique, and it is also called the interior monologue technique, because when you are capturing somebody's thought and what the person is thinking one by one, then you are actually putting into words what is a monologue that the person is saying. If you think that thought is the word, then whatever we are thinking, if you simply write it down, it will become a monologue spoken by that particular character. But it is not something which is spoken out, but it is interiorized. And Woolf's unique approach is this third person interiorized narration. It's easy to, I won't say easy, but it is more natural for a writer of stream of consciousness to use the first person narrative technique like we have in Joyce's portrait. Why? Because it is very believable if I am writing a book where the narrator is telling his or her own story, saying that this happened to me, I was thinking this, then I was looking at that. So it is very believable that yes, the narrator can know about what is going on inside the narrator's head. So it is possible for a narrator to narrate his own chain of thoughts. So first person narrative technique is still common in case of stream of consciousness. But when you transfer this whole thing to a third person perspective, you are at once challenging conventions and rebuilding it. And this particular technique is called free indirect discourse. Remember this phrase. Free indirect, because it is not restricted to one character. If you have a narrator who can look inside the mind of one character, then that narrator can look inside the mind of any character. It's very much like an omniscient narrator. But it is not a direct narration from the characters. So it is always indirect. So free indirect discourse. Discourse means anything that you place as a formal writing is a discourse. So this interiorized third person or free interior discourse is the technical term we associate with the Virginia Woolfian brand of stream of consciousness. So it's a subcategory, you can say. Unlike Joyce, who uses a purely interior monologue technique. So in Woolf, in Dalloway, we'll see this. If you look at another novel like To the Lighthouse, the same thing is happening there. The narrator shifts from one character's mind to another character's mind. And sometimes it so happens, as you'll find if you read To the Lighthouse, that even the house, which is supposed to be a non-sentient being, a non-person, even the house is shown to have a certain stream of consciousness. This is narrated in such a way. And when Woolf's narrator shifts from one character to another, it doesn't disappear. And I'm saying he. I shouldn't gender Woolf's narrator. She was very androgynous when she's writing. It's like you cannot pin down her narrator as belonging to a certain gender. This narrator moves seamlessly between characters as well as between the inner world and the outer world, because in Dalloway, in To the Lighthouse, you have not just the what's happening inside the minds of the characters, but also actual events happening outside the minds. That is, there is a constant negotiation between the two worlds. And this allows Woolf to explore multiple consciousness and give a rounded picture of the society, yet maintaining focus on the individual. When we will read through the text, I'll try to read as many important passages as possible, although it will not be a practical thing for me to read all the lines. And you very well know that when I cover any novel, I usually focus on most important passages. I'll try to point out the instances which you can refer to in your answer on stream of consciousness or narrative strategy of Woolf. So while reading the text, we'll keep our eyes open. We'll also have to remember that this stream of consciousness technique, especially the one which Virginia Woolf uses, the free indirect discourse, it humanizes the characters. We get multiple perspectives and it replaces plot with consciousness. Earlier, plot was a very important factor when it came to fiction. Now, consciousness is an important factor. What is plot? If you look at Aristotle's definition, plot is like a sequence of events which are connected through probability and necessity. That something has happened, so out of that something else is probable and necessary to happen. So that will happen. So there is a connection of logic, rationality, reason. But when it comes to consciousness, as apparently we are always having these disconnected thoughts connected together, so this whole idea of plot breaks down. So plotless novels. Yet there is something tying up the things, right? Because unless there is something connecting one thing to another, why will you go from the first page to the second page? And then if it does not have a plot, how can we have a summary? And that is exactly why students who study the summary of Mrs. Dalloway, summary of To the Lighthouse, summary of A Portrait perform miserably. If the question is a little out of line, it's very difficult. And you will never have that feeling as a reader if you look at the summary of these novels. It's actually a criminal offense to attempt any summary, but then sadly I have to summarize the plot today because I'm planning to give you a very basic overview so that when we start the text we have certain expectations in our minds. So what is this basic overview? I wouldn't call it summary. I already told you that this is the story of one single day in the life of the central character, Clarissa Dalloway. What makes me say that Clarissa Dalloway is the central character? The title tells me. In a novel like To the Lighthouse, we do not have such central character named in the title. So there we might be in confusion. But here it is already stated to us that this is going to be focused on Clarissa Dalloway. But she is not the only character. This is her life one day, and possibly this is 14th June. What makes me say it is 14th June? Because that is what the critics conjecture. Although Virginia Woolf does not specify it explicitly anyway. It is post First World War London. The entire action takes place roughly around in a time span of 12 hours, morning to the late hours of the night. And from the very beginning, the central action seems to be a party which Clarissa Dalloway, she belongs to the upper middle class section. She is going to host a party. And from the very beginning of the novel, the entire focus of the narration seems to be on that. Now this structure, describing only one single day, this is also seen in James Joyce's Ulysses, a much fatter book. And I really have no plans right now to deal with something like that. I would need really, really powerful motivation for that. But yes, it's very similar if I am talking about this setup, this structure of one day. There is no major external drama, although we have a specific character named as the titular hero, that is Mrs. Dalloway. We also have another very, very important character whose name is Septimus. Who is Clarissa? Clarissa is a high society woman. She is in her early 50s, preparing to host a party. What was Virginia Woolf's age when she was writing this? Born in 1882, so she was past her 40s. You will find so many connections to her own life in this novel that you might be tempted to think that this was a very, very autobiographical depiction, rather. But Clarissa Dalloway is so different from Virginia Woolf as a person as well that sometimes you really get confused that is she talking about herself or about a completely different person. Because Clarissa Dalloway is not just the person that she appears to be. And this is where the conflict comes. The entire world looks at Clarissa Dalloway as something settled in life, having a great husband, lots of potential as a social being, hosting parties. But what goes on in her mind? What does she think about her lost love, aging, mortality, parenting? And how do we get access to her inner thoughts? When she is on a walk. She's got out of her house, going for a walk, planning to buy flowers for the party. And while walking, she has these thoughts, one after another, flashbacks to her childhood. And the best thing about memories is that you don't need to have tickets. You can just speed away to any far end of your childhood as you are permitted by your brain. Who is Septimus Smith? Septimus Warren Smith is a war veteran. He suffers from shell shock. And what is shell shock? It's like a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And soldiers back then who fought in the First World War, this was a very, very new experience for them. And no matter how many wars you go to, it's always a traumatic experience, I know. First World War was the First World War, and it had its own demons. So Septimus Warren Smith, he had suffered through these episodes where he is not able to get over his trauma that he had suffered during the war, seeing his friends die. So that memory of violence is continued in him even when Europe had turned peaceful. So he is constantly haunted, especially by the visions of his dead friend Evans. Interestingly, Septimus and Clarissa, the two most important characters in the novel, they never meet in the novel. It's like two parallel universes are presented. Then how are they connected? There must be some connection. Just like the two thoughts in our minds, they are also connected in a very, very gruesome manner. They are connected through violence. Violence that Septimus inflicts on himself. He kills himself. And how does it affect Clarissa? It affects her party. I won't be giving out any more spoilers today because then you will not be listening to the next two videos where we will be going through the text, right? So this is the least I wanted you to know. I also want you to know that Virginia Woolf considered Clarissa as a double of Septimus. Now imagine a housewife in a posh location, hosting parties, double of a war veteran who kills himself. Double means what? Parallel character, similar character. So if they are so different in their appearance, where can the similarity lie? You got it. It's in that stream of consciousness that they have inside. And when the two streams meet, it is at that point that we realize the universality of this novel. That if this novel can establish Clarissa's life, her angst is a very strong word, but that word was born after this World War trauma, that anxiety, that inability to accept one's place in the world, that angst. That angst of Clarissa and the angst of Septimus is ultimately the angst of you and me. And one thing is for sure, if fiction doesn't make you feel connected to the plight of the characters, then it will never stand the test of time. It will never have relevance 100 years after it is written, and this novel is still loved so much. 102 years have passed since its publication, and even today when I read it, every time I reread the book, I discover something new. So Mrs. Dalloway's plot, or rather Mrs. Dalloway's narrative, is not driven by what happens, but by what is felt and thought. The blend of external events, the walk, a party, a suicide, with internal worlds, memory, emotion, trauma, this blend is what makes this novel so very extraordinary. In fact, in 2002, a film came, The Hours. Nicole Kidman played a very important role there. If possible, I'll give the link in the description or maybe in the I button. This film was directed by Stephen Daldry, and it was based on a novel by Michael Cunningham. But why am I talking about this film? This film presents three interwoven narratives. What narratives? One narrative is set during a day in Virginia Woolf's life when she begins to write Mrs. Dalloway, the novel. Okay. Another narrative features a 1950s housewife, that is somebody who comes almost 30 years after its publication, who is reading that novel. And what is the third narrative line? It is modern day New York, where a person is throwing a party just like Clarissa Dalloway had thrown. And these three narratives, they are so beautifully intertwined. And the way Nicole Kidman played the part of Virginia Woolf was amazing. She actually won an Academy Award, if I'm not wrong. It draws heavily, this whole film, on the themes that we have in Mrs. Dalloway. Passage of time, the complexity of inner lives, the question of whether our daily routines carry any deep meaning at all. So it's like a modern adaptation of Virginia Woolf's entire style of conceptualizing Mrs. Dalloway. So now that we have some basic understanding, we can hope to decipher the codes, the symbols, the narrative brilliance of Mrs. Dalloway. And in the following two classes, I will take up the most important passages, read them out to you, explain in details why those are important. We'll try to focus on the central symbols, themes, techniques that she uses, and of course, we will focus on the main characters we come across. And in the last video of the series, we'll definitely talk about the most important questions you should prepare and the points you should have in your answer. This text is a part of UPSC syllabus, and it is also prescribed for UG or PG level English. Do let me know in the comment section why you are interested in the text, and also don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell because you really don't want to miss the next video after this. So see you all very soon. Till then, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye bye.